Good morning. It's Tuesday, February 8th. It's 10:32 a.m. and this is the meeting of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. Today we're continuing our work on bills in front of us. The two major bills we're working on at the moment are the Act 250 bill, so housing and forestry in particular, as well as the environmental justice bill. But we'll be doing other work this week. For instance, we have a hearing on a group of three fish and wildlife bills on Thursday evening. So it'll be an interesting week. One of the questions, one of the pressures everyone is feeling is how to make sure that the programs we have can, for instance, on our Act 250 work, how do we do good work on planning, but also have that planning implemented in an efficient enough way that it doesn't impinge on meeting the Arpa funding deadlines, namely obligations by the end of 2024 and expended by the end of 2026. So JFO is visiting with us this morning to help us understand the funding constraints, and in particular, one of the areas we're most interested in is where we're going to be going next on bills is weatherization. So good morning, Ms. Manchester. Thanks for coming back and helping us interpret what ARPA is and isn't eligible, and that's some of the topics we're interested in working on.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. For the record, I'm Joyce Manchester from the Joint Fiscal Office. I do have a presentation that's rather brief, but it does have some good information in it. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope you're seeing.
Yes, ma'am.
Very good. All right. So I was specifically asked to look at funding sources for training the weatherization workforce today. And if you are interested in a broader look at ARPA and IIJA funds for weatherization in general, I can talk briefly about that as well.
Well, thank you for that clarification. And right, this was the specific thing, you're right, absolutely, that we asked for. But if you can shed light on broader application of ARPA funds to weatherization, that will be helpful too. Thanks.
Okay, fine. Let's see, why is my screen not advancing? There we go. So today I'm going to talk about the goals of S284, specifically with respect to weatherization training. I'm going to talk about constraints around ARPA funding and constraints around IIJA funding. We'll see how that goes. First, we're looking at S284, and the goal is to weatherize 120,000 housing units by 2031 and to create the weatherization working group to make recommendations on funding sources and create the necessary workforce. So, that's essentially what it talks about in this slide. I'm just using the language from the bill. The weatherization working group shall make recommendations on near-term and long-term funding sources and on the creation of a workforce to provide energy and financial counseling and coaching services, and the creation of a workforce to provide weatherization and energy services. So there's this two-pronged approach, both the counseling and energy side, and then the actual weatherization services. So what do we know about ARPA funding? Well, I'm looking specifically at the state fiscal recovery funds. Those are the ARPA funds that are going to the state of Vermont. The bottom line is that maybe some of those funds can be used for training the weatherization workforce. And let's talk about why it's a maybe. So you remember that Vermont received about $1 billion in the state fiscal recovery funds, And as the chair stated, they need to be obligated by the end of 2024 and spent by the end of 2026. They are meant to respond to the public health impacts and negative economic impacts of the pandemic. So ARPA, something to keep in mind is that it's supposed to be tied to the pandemic in some way. Specifically, those state fiscal recovery funds can support households who are negatively affected by the pandemic. And generally, we think about households with lower income, households who live in rural areas, and other households who were affected disproportionately by the pandemic. So Act 74, that was the big bill back in June of 2021, appropriated $1 million to weatherization training. So the Agency of Administration is currently looking closely at this specific provision. They are currently marking this provision, the $1 million for weatherization training out of ARPA, as moderate risk, meaning they're not sure that it passes muster for eligibility for ARPA funds. So they are working with Guidehouse. They are looking carefully at all the guidance that's coming out from the federal government, and they are still evaluating whether those state fiscal recovery funds can be used for weatherization training. So that's sort of a mixed picture. We're not sure about whether those ARPA funds are allowed or not. And again, part of the issue here is that those SFR funds, state fiscal recovery funds, should be used specifically for pandemic-related programs. And so the question is, can you somehow define weatherization training as being specifically related to the pandemic, or specifically helping households that were disproportionately affected by the pandemic?
Ms. Manchester, can I ask a question? I mean, I don't know how one sorts that out exactly, but for instance, low-income weather, so the low-income weatherization program, for instance, has documented the health benefits of improved indoor air quality as the result of weatherization work. So if you're in the midst of a pandemic, if you're lower income and more disproportionately in a population disproportionately affected by COVID, is something I think as genuine as improving indoor air quality or living situation. It's one step removed from sort of COVID, but there's a very real connection between the two. So do you know how expansive the sort of interpretations get? I know this is kind of a fuzzy question, but it strikes me as there's a genuine connection, but I don't know how, once you get it in black and white on a document, if anyone can see that kind of connection we're discussing right here now.
Right, so that fuzzy connection was what was relied on back when the big bill was passed. And the fuzzy connection is what's being investigated now by the Agency of Administration and Guidehouse. And there has been additional guidance released by the federal government since the big bill was passed. So I think that AOA and Guidehouse are trying to be careful and just checking out all the available information about what is eligible. But I agree, it's well documented that weatherization helps people living in homes that should be weatherized, and some of those people are households with lower income. Absolutely, there should be a connection there. The question is, can you train people to do weatherization? Do they have to be specifically targeted at those households with lower income or rural households or whatever? So there are questions still unresolved.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Senator Westman?
So my question is, when do we have any idea when we will get an idea of whether or not this is a legitimate way to spend this money? And do we think it will be before we move next year's budget out of the Senate so we can react to this?
Yes, thank you, Senator. That's That's a very good question. I don't have the answer. I would think that Douglas Farnham might be the person to ask because he's sort of the point person working on this question and working with Guidehouse. So Sarah Clark in our office has been in contact, frequent contact with Douglas Farnham to follow along with progress as it's being made, but we just don't know how soon that will be resolved.
Now, it will be important for us as we construct the budget or whatever documents go through if we're going to weigh in on this issue.
Yes, understood.
Thank you.
All right. Now, I could just offer comments that anytime you're thinking about using ARPA funds, you do need to think about that connection to the pandemic and the households who were most negatively impacted by the pandemic. So that's in general the word of the day for ARPA funding. And now I'm going to move on to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Of course, it became law in November of 2021. It does contain funds for training individuals to do energy audits. So we're going to look at that language specifically, but there's nothing about weatherization training specifically in IIJA. There's lots of language about doing weatherization, just not specifically about training the workforce to do weatherization. Okay, so there is an energy auditor training grant program. And on this slide, I have given you a link to the Infrastructure Act guidebook that came out maybe a week or two ago. It's relatively recent. It's also 450 pages, so and be sure that you have a good find function on your computer before you start looking through it. But so there is this Energy Auditor Training Grant Program to provide grants to eligible states to train individuals to conduct energy audits or surveys of both commercial and residential buildings. So this is to build the clean energy workforce, save customers money on their energy bills, and reduce pollution from building energy use. So there's $40 million for the US. Grant applications are open in the second quarter, so starting in April of this year. It's unclear to me whether the grants are allocated by state. So do we get 0.16% of $40 million because Vermont's GDP is 0.16% of US GDP, or is this awarded on the basis of the worthiness of the application? That is not clear in the information we have so far. But it does seem that if you were training auditors to do these energy audits, that would be a first step in the weatherization process. So I've given you.
Are we all set on that, Mr. Chair?
I'm sorry, Senator McDonald, can you say it again? I couldn't quite hear that.
Haven't we had energy auditors for the last 2 decades? Is that not one of the few things that has already been done here in the state?
Yes, we have had auditors for decades, and the only thing I don't know, or one of the things I don't know is, would anyone say that as we ramp up the weatherization program that we would need more capacity there? But that's a good question. So I'll add that to my list of questions.
My understanding is that the scale of weatherization has to ramp up very rapidly in order to meet the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act. So whereas we have been weatherizing maybe 2,000 homes per year, and that's considered a lot, we are going to have to ramp up quite rapidly to 10,000, 20,000 homes per year. So it looks like we will need a big increase in the workforce at all stages of the weatherization process.
Senator McDonald, anything else?
No, I would say there's probably a backlog of people who've been audited, but I don't disagree. Of all the challenges we have, that seems to be one that we are well headed down the road. Thank you.
Right, right. Point taken. Yeah, that may not be our limiting element in the chain of events that has to happen yet. Thanks.
Right. I did want to point out that there are some other opportunities within the IIJA, but they don't necessarily send the funds to the state. So for example, there are grants available to nonprofit partnerships for career skills training, and that might include something like weatherization. There are grants available to institutions of higher learning, again, not states, for building, training, and assessment centers. And again, you could think that might involve the weatherization workforce. But again, those are funds that do not come to the state of Vermont. They go to nonprofits or higher education institutions.
So for instance, Vermont Technical College has programs related to energy work, auditing, insulating, et cetera. So VTC or other state colleges it looks like they could apply for a grant. Is this a grant program? So they would be applicants?
Yes, a grant program. And I don't know how the grants are allocated, whether it's by state or by quality of application. Not much guidance on that.
Okay, thank you.
So that's the end of my presentation. I did want to mention that generally speaking for IIJA money, there is a state match. So anytime you talk about using IIJA funds, you have to provide that state match to go along with the federal funds. So once all the sources of funding get sorted out, there will have to be a reckoning in terms of state monies, federal monies, which pots of federal monies, which pots of state monies, and so forth. But just to mention a few of the big sources of funding for weatherization within IIJA, there is, I'm talking at the national level now, and again, I don't know how this will be allocated across states, but there is $3.5 billion across the country for the Weatherization Assistance Program. So that's specifically targeted at families with low income. There's also $500 million over 5 years for the Low Income Health Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP. So again, that provides extra funding for the LIHEAP program that could involve changes in fuel and so forth for households with low income. And let's see. Okay, so that's the end, right? Those are the two big sources, but the 3.5 billion sounds like a lot of money, and you'd think that there would be a sizable amount coming to Vermont out of that 3.5 billion.
Okay, and on the 3.5 billion, so there's no guidance yet as to whether states or institutions or nonprofits make an application for that, or the Congress will divvy the money up according to some formula and just allocate it to us.
So there are a number of programs underneath that large 3.5 billion, and the various programs are described briefly in the big guidance document that on this Infrastructure Act guidebook. Yep. So it's easy to find the 3.5 billion and then to look at the underlying programs if you're interested in seeing. It's a rather brief description, as I say, and it simply says in many cases grant program, which means you have to apply, but what are the criteria? We don't know.
Okay. You mentioned the requirement that there is a state match. Do you know what the ratio is, the match ratio?
I don't know what the match ratio is, and I'm not sure that we know that for specific programs at this point. I can check on that, but I'm not aware that we know.
Okay. Right. I mean, if it's like highway dollars at 90-10, that would be much better news than 50-50 or something, for sure. Senator McDonald?
Mr. Chair, it seems that we would include language in our bill which authorizes the entities that might be inspecting and training to apply for these grants. And reference the 400 and some page document is the place where you might find the, where to go and apply for them, and that there be some language that permits that money to be appropriated for the purposes of the bill. And I imagine the Appropriations Committee folks or the folks that draft for the Appropriations Committee would be able to put forth such a provision to be included in this bill. And that, I don't know if we need to. I mean, that's what I think we ought to, in action we ought to try and take, and then spend our time on how to deal with the rest of the, the law around the rest of the things that weatherization is going to entail.
Okay, great. And Senator McDonald, I think you have been thinking about those other elements. If you could, either we can, I don't know that we need to, if you have them handy, we can pause and you could walk briefly through them. Thank you, Ms. Manchester. Or we could, if you want, send me the list and we'll put some time in the agenda to look at the context around this funding piece that we're looking at right now. So,
yeah, I got a list of tasks that have to be accomplished in order to weatherize homes. And at any time that you would like to set some time aside for that, I can run through them.
Okay, great. Thank you. Putting it on my list. And any questions for Ms. Manchester? So it's now that thank you for gathering that information up. I know you're trying to wrestle something that's still in development, so it's hard to know exactly where we're going to land. Given our schedule, which is that we vote a bill out that makes crossover, I'm sensing that we may not well know the answers entirely clearly by then, and we'll have to look at some sort of flexible construct. And last year we worked with the Appropriations Committee right down to the finish line because information kept emerging right up until voting a budget. And so Senator Westman was a key member in keeping the two committees synced up one with the other. So maybe that's what we're going to need to do again, which worked out well. So I guess that's the hand we're dealt. So that's what we'll have to stay flexible to the finish line. Okay. Any other questions for Ms. Manchester? All right. So thanks once again for coming back in, and we'll stay in touch. Now we have that link. I don't know if I'm going to be printing out the 425-page version, but maybe I'll skim ahead to in the electronic document and find the references you were citing and get that detail. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
So with that, I'm going to turn back to the Act 250 bill. We have, again, two bills. We have a witness coming in on Senator McCormick's bill today. We were going to have two, a medical situation came up, and so we're having one today and one tomorrow. Wanted to get some feedback, just as we basically asked the world of people who would actually use the proposals that we're talking about, whether or not they're actually interested in us moving them forward. I would say for the proposal in 234, the answer was politely, but pretty clearly, no, thank you. That the smart growth designation on top of a system of 5 other designations was a little bit complicated and burdensome and not that attractive a route to helping get more housing done in developed areas sooner, or at least in time to meet the pressures of the Arpa funding cycle. So I want to offer the same opportunity for us to be hearing about 200 as another means of achieving the same end. So we'll hear from witnesses there. But for the part of 234, as the lead sponsor, I said, okay, time for me to, move on and come up with another proposal, and bring it to the committee. We've talked some about it, but nothing like a draft in order to help us see things and then have an orderly conversation. So I asked Ms. Chakowski to pull together a number of provisions we've talked about. Basically, I would say, I'm conceiving of it as the, ARPA funded, whatever we call it, accelerated ARPA funded housing initiative. And in it, we provide incentives in the form of a release from the Act 250 process for priority housing projects in designated areas. But because what's driving all this was the statement that we don't want to lose any ARPA funds. There's a time pressure, and I do get it that it's a long way from one end to the other to think about a housing project to having the thing constructed. So I appreciate it. It's not an easy task, and it's got a lot of players over a long period of time. So we're treating that request seriously in this draft, and it says, okay, while we have ARPA funds available, we will offer this kind of accelerated pathway to folks. But honestly, no one on the planet can tell us, is this a good idea or not? Might there be unintended consequences that we would one day regret? Or do we see unexpected successes that we would say, based on what we just saw, we would like to make permanent law and carry on? So the bill is set up that the provisions that I've asked Ms. Chakowski to build into the strike all last from now through 2027. The provisions sunset, and there's a report that that is developed in that last year so that the subsequent legislature can decide whether or not the program was a success, if it had some flaws, some strengths, whatever, but to put ourselves in a position to evaluate how well it worked. And I know that this has been in flux, and I've been talking to Ms. Chakowski about it. So this is still, whatever, live text. So I just wanted to say that that's the idea. And Ms. Chakowski, you just had your hand up. So I don't know if you want to chip in something or not before we do the walkthrough.
Yeah, none of that is in this draft.
Okay, so that's in the background, like as a way of putting some guardrails on the experiment. You could call it an experiment in accelerated housing. How well does it work? We better collect data, otherwise we're not going to be in a position to judge it.
Also, we should probably fully discuss that because priority housing projects in designated areas are already exempt from Act 250.
Right.
Okay.
So with that's the construct. The second, so it's really just replacing the front half of the bill as introduced with a new construct around housing. The second half of the bill is largely, the forestry related pieces are largely unchanged. Although I had asked, we have another bill in that looked at ag innovation, and it seemed as though as long as we're going to be thinking about Act 250 and how does it apply to an evolving economy, why not look at that at the same time? So with that preamble concluded, Ms. Chakowski, well, let me pause and just ask, are there any committee questions? Okay, so let's take a look at the next proposal, and we'll walk through that and play it from there. Overall, just for everyone's frame of reference, I'm still hoping that roughly a week from today, we will have had enough back and forth working with the different parties that will have a bill that's ready to move out of committee. Okay. So, Ms. Chakowski, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So posted on the website today is a strike all amendment, draft 1.1. Senator Bray, I think you're going to need to do more introduction because there's a lot of other sections in here highlighted in yellow that you haven't mentioned that there's a lot of other changes.
Yes.
Including the first 5 sections of the bill. So.
Well, okay, so they're all housing related provisions. Let's just do the walk through rather than me sort of making an editorial comment on all of them up front. But yeah, and there's also, we talked about, for instance, we took testimony on airports, prime ag soil mitigation related to state-owned airports. So my sense was that that was a reasonable request for us to consider including. And so we'd be, for this draft, that's included in the bill, just to get it in motion again. And then Senator Brock had a suggestion about adding an environmental division judge in order to help alleviate any concerns around lengthy processing time for appeals. So that seems like it also could help us work at a faster clip on housing related projects. So that too is included. So I've been picking up pieces from other bills to roll into this bill. And again, it's just a proposal for our committee to go through and help us start editing as a committee. And editing with input from folks outside. So we'll be hearing from different parties in the coming days. So with that, Ms. Chakowski.
Okay, so the new language in this draft that is different from the underlying bill is highlighted in yellow. So sections 1 through 5 that I'm about to go through are new to this committee. Sections 1 through 3, well, sections 1 through 5 are language that was proposed in H511, which is a bill in the House. And I'll walk you through it. I did want to point out first that sections 1 through 3 are related to municipal zoning. That's why I added a heading here on municipal zoning. They amend sections in Title 24. I did just want to flag that this bill is called an act relating to changes to Act 250. These are not Act 250 related sections. You may want to think about that.
Okay. Thanks for flagging that. And because this committee deals with both Act 250 and Title 24 municipal planning, we're interested in land use and planning at least 3 different levels. There's the Act 250 level, there's the regional planning level, and there's the municipal level. So sometimes I think I say Act 250 when I really should be saying something broader. So thanks for that clarification.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Senator McDonald.
Is there a paper copy of what Ms. Chakowski is going to share with us somewhere in the State House building?
I don't think we have hard copies printed in the old style, like the lawyer coming into committee with a stack of hard copy in hand.
You could send it to Tony in the copy room if you'd like a copy. I can put it up on the screen too, if that would be easier.
Well, if someone would send it to Tony in the copy room, when it's printed, it would take me 2 minutes to go and fetch it. So I would, if that was possible, that would be helpful. And that's a selfish request.
I would say I'm not in my office. I'm away from my office, and I only have my iPad. So if you put it on the screen, it would be helpful.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, I'm getting ahead of myself. Yes. Okay. Jude, would you be able to email it to Tony and have it printed? Since I'm doing.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm
wonderful.
doing 2 things.
And if Jude, would you text me when it's printed and I will go fetch it? Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
No problem. I want to make sure everyone, whether they're at home, traveling, whatever, has access to the information. It's a little bit of juggling each day. Thank you. So thanks for the question.
Okay, I have put the copy of the amendment on the screen. Can you see it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So first, section 1 is amending 24 VSA 2793E. This section, as Senator Bray just mentioned, these new sections are replacing the proposal that was to create a smart growth designation program related to an Act 250 exemption. This is a similar area of law, but it's not doing anything related to adding a new designation. It's just amending some underlying designation programs. So first, 2793E is the statute that establishes the requirements for what a municipality needs to do in order to have a designated neighborhood development area. And this committee has talked about that a little bit, but this is some new language related to that. So first, the new language is on page 2, and this is the list of requirements a municipality needs to provide in order to get the designation. So there's new language that's added on line 6 of page 2 that would allow multiple towns to submit a joint application for a designated neighborhood development area. So this is a change. So starting on line 4, to ensure a compact settlement pattern, the outer boundary of the neighborhood planning area shall be located entirely within the boundaries of the applicant municipality, unless a joint application is submitted by one or more municipality, and shall be determined ... So currently, only individual towns can apply for a designation because it has to be an area wholly within the boundaries of one town. This is allowing that towns can apply jointly to achieve neighborhood development areas.
Thank you. And I don't recall offhand, I think there is a situation, like many things that crop up in bills, I think this responds to a request to a particular application in a particular situation. So unless Mr. Chakowski happens to know, we'll get some testimony on what the motivation for having this request. Thanks.
So,
Senator Westman?
no, I was just, I can only think of a very few handfuls of places where that would apply.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Next, so now we're still talking about the elements of a neighborhood development area. So next, this section is about what area of the town can actually be included in the neighborhood development area. So starting on line 13, the proposed neighborhood development area consists of those portions of the neighborhood planning area that are appropriate for new and infill housing, excluding identified flood hazard and fluvial erosion areas. So I'm going to stop there and say that is what the law is currently. What happens is a circle is drawn. It's put in statute. It's not shown on this page, but there is a circle drawn around a core designation, either a downtown, new town center, or village center. And so currently, though, it says that identified flood hazard areas and fluvial erosion areas are excluded from the neighborhood development area. And that means when there's this map showing what the NDA is, the river part of the area is carved out and is not technically part of the NDA. And what this means on the ground is that mostly what the NDA designation is used for, like the other designations, is for incentive programs and/or there's been a lot of discussion about Act 250 exemptions. But there are incentives for buildings located in the NDA, as well as buildings located in the NDA are eligible for the priority housing project designation. So currently, a building that is located in the flood hazard area is not part of the NDA and is therefore not currently eligible for these additional incentives. But this bill is adding some language to change that. So on line 16, except those areas containing pre-existing development in areas suitable for infill development as defined in section 29-201 of the Vermont Flood Hazard Area and River Corridor Rule. So what this is saying is that currently areas in the flood hazard and fluvial erosion area are excluded from the NDA. But this is now adding, except if there is pre-existing development suitable for infill development as defined in ANR's flood hazard and river corridor rules.
And I think sort of my editorial comment, I would, like why is this here, is because as I understand it, and we'll take testimony on it, that the cross-reference flood hazard area and river corridor rule is the most up-to-date position of Agency of Natural Resources as it relates to how to manage development related to the hazards that rivers, impose on development. And I think it's also an acknowledgement that although ideally you would never be in an area that's subject to flooding, in fact, our historical settlement patterns have us locating routinely along rivers because they had value. So we have a lot of places where the two are combined, whether we like it or not. How do we manage it more successfully is the goal of the proposed edit. We'll take testimony to make sure that this does reflect an improvement as before assuming so. So Senator McCormick.
Thanks. Ellen, you referred to incentives. Do those incentives include exemptions from Act 250? Is that one of the incentives?
So the only current existing exemption from Act 250 is for the priority housing projects. So yes, a project that will be a priority housing project has to be
located. Already exempt.
Yeah, so that is exempt. So by extending, this is adding additional areas that can be part of the NDA. And so it would be opening those areas up, those with pre-existing development in the flood hazard and fluvial erosion areas are now going to be eligible to become PHPs and be exempt from Act 250.
Yeah. Okay, so there will be new Act 250 exemptions.
Yeah, new areas available for Act 250 exemptions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, the basic one is, I lost that years ago. Okay. And now we're expanding it. Thank you. That's all I needed to know. That's all I was asking.
Thanks, Senator McCormick.
Okay, so the next change is on page 3. So we're still in this area related to the requirements. So at the bottom of page 2 into page 3, so based on the considerations, there's more language, and if you'd like me to go into detail on these requirements, I can. But going back to the language, the municipality shall select an area for a neighborhood development designation that, and now I'm on line 3 of page 3, that avoids or minimizes to the extent feasible the inclusion of important natural resources as defined in 2791. An important natural resource is included within if an important natural resource is included within a proposed NDA, the applicant shall identify the resource, explain why the resource was included, describe any anticipated disturbance to the resource, and describe why the disturbance cannot be avoided or minimized. If the NDA includes flood hazard areas or river corridors, the local bylaw shall contain provisions consistent with ANR's rules under section 754 of Title A, 10 VSA section 754A which are the flood hazard provisions in Title 10. To ensure that new infill development within an NDA occurs outside flood hazard area and will not cause or contribute to fluvial erosion hazards within the river corridor. If the NDA includes flood hazard areas or river corridors, local bylaws shall contain provisions to protect river corridors outside the NDA consistent with ANR's rules. So if a town is applying for an NDA and they have a river corridor or flood hazard area, the town has to adopt the model bylaws provided by ANR related to flood hazard and river corridor areas. Those bylaws need to extend not only to the NDA area, but also to the entire town. That's what that second section is saying. So it is requiring that they adopt the model bylaws.
Thank you. Any questions on that? Okay.
All right, still next on to page 4, still within the language related to the requirements for a neighborhood development area. So currently number 6 on the list of requirements is that a neighborhood development area is served by municipal sewer infrastructure or a community or alternative wastewater system approved by ANR. And this language would be repealed so that that would no longer be a requirement.
And I'll just, so the question I had was, well, then are these systems, are we setting ourselves up for trouble because we're eliminating these requirements? And the answer, as I understand it, I'll ask counsel to correct me if I'm off the mark here, is that any such application would require that you get, so this is a requirement that burdens the municipality applying for the designation to be able to check box A or B. If they don't do that, then it becomes a requirement imposed on the developer to get their wastewater and drinking water permits from ANR. So there's still scrutiny over and regulation of what kind of connections and wastewater you have, but it becomes an obligation of the applicant for the permit for the project owner or developer. Is that the right way to look at this shift?
Yes, this is taking that responsibility off of the municipality. So someone would presumably need to provide for wastewater, just not the municipality.
So anyway, I think that will be one where we want to get more testimony on, but that's my understanding of what the shift, in a certain way, it privatizes the responsibility. If you're doing the development, you're also going to have the responsibility for providing for wastewater drinking water, which you already would have had, but it may have been easier if the town had preceded you and, for instance, built municipal sewer infrastructure to the site so. Right, so let's keep going.
Okay, and the last change here in the section related to neighborhood development areas is related to the required density. So neighborhood development areas are required to have bylaws that allow dense development in them. So starting on line 5, the municipal bylaws allow minimum net residential densities within the NDA greater than or equal to 4 dwelling units per acre for all identified residential uses or residential building types, exclusive of accessory dwelling units, or not fewer than the average existing density of the surrounding neighborhood, whichever is greater. And the methodology for calculating density shall be established in guidelines developed by the Department of Housing and Community Development. So Currently, the statute requires density of 4 single-family detached dwelling units per acre. This is changing it so that the calculation is based on any type of residential dwelling unit can be included. So that would be duplexes or multi-unit dwellings like apartment buildings. And so that is included in the designation, in the calculation, as opposed to just 4 single-family homes per acre.
And then the second part too, I think that, so the idea was the 4 is a minimum. If you have another part of town zoned more densely than that your NDA needs to be zoned at that equivalent to that greater than 4 unit per acre density. The whole idea, I think, from the way I was thinking about this was, let's design to get as much housing as possible out of the designated area.
Right, so that is existing law currently. The NDA is supposed to be the most dense part of the area. That it's just changing. The change on line 8 from no to not is just a stylistic change.
Sure.
Section 2 is amending 24 VSA 2793B, which is the section of law on the designated new town centers. So these are another one of the designations. It's one of the core designations. So again, we're looking at the requirements, and on page 5, there's language related to density that's almost identical to the language we just looked at. So it's adding some clarification to the density requirements for new town centers. So this is requiring that the municipality contains the following: regulations enabling densities that are not less than 4 dwelling units, including all identified residential uses or residential building types per acre, and not less than those allowed in any part of the municipality not within the designated area under this chapter. So again, saying the areas outside the new town center should not be more dense than the new town center. And it's just clarifying that it should be not less than 4 dwelling units per acre. Okay, section 3 is amending 24 VSA 4449. So we're still in Title 24 in the municipal zoning chapter, chapter 117. So now we're in the section on zoning permits. So within any municipality which has any bylaws that have been adopted, no municipal land use permit issued by an appropriate municipal panel or administrative officer, as applicable, for a site plan or conditional use, and so those are 2 different types of permits a town can issue, shall be considered abandoned or expired unless more than 2 years has passed since the permit approval was issued. So currently under statute, there's no reference to how long a municipal permit should last before it expires. And the sponsor of this bill had received information that some municipal permits expire after only a year. And then if that happens and construction hasn't been finished, they need to reapply. And so this is saying if a site plan permit or conditional use permit have been issued, they cannot expire unless more than 2 years has passed. So this is setting a baseline that these permits need to last at least 2 years before they expire.
And I would consider this one sort of a housekeeping thing. If we're trying to eliminate, if we're trying to assure the smooth operation of permitting and development, then let's not have people face the hiccup of permits expiring during the middle of a project while they're still actually working.
Okay, on to page 6. So this is still language from 511, and this is going to amend the definition of priority housing projects, which you have already been talking about a bit. So the words on this page are going to be a little bit confusing, but you all know this concept. This is about the concept of the fact that priority housing projects have a cap on the number of units. Currently under law, priority housing projects are exempt up to a certain size. So this is changing the cap, and down on line, you'll see down on line 20, it's so down at the bottom of page 6 onto page 7. So currently for the smallest towns, someone developing priority housing projects, the cap is 25 units. So up to 25 units of priority housing projects are exempt from Act 250 in towns with a population less than 3,000. So this is being changed at the bottom of page 6 to just say 50 units in a municipality with a population of less than 6,000. So it's bringing up the smallest cap and just saying the minimum number of units is 50 units that are exempt from Act 250. Okay, the next change is at the bottom of page 7. So we're still in the definition section of Act 250, and this is adding 2 changes that I think you have seen in prior session bills. This is changing the definition of floodway to flood hazard area and giving it the same definition as in Title 10 under the flood hazard area chapter. So it's bringing it up to match ANR's current working definition on this issue. And the same thing with number 7. Floodway fringe is being changed to river corridor.
I think we brought this language to the floor in 926. That sound possible?
I don't think you did. I think it came over in the H926 as passed the House because the version you passed was only 9 pages. So at least I think you've seen it before, but this is related to updating criterion 1D, which is a little bit further down in this draft. So this language has been proposed in a few other prior Act 250 bills.
Mr. Chair,
Senator McDonald.
is this language housekeeping to keep things consistent, or does it permit something that was not previously permitted?
I think the agency would describe this as housekeeping because now it matches the language the agency currently uses for these areas.
And it's not by the virtue of the change allowing something new or something different.
I don't think so, but I do think that is an issue you should take testimony on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McDonald. Blue flag has been applied to that section. All right.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, sir.
just I'm only able to ask the question because Jude sent me to the Finance Committee room the text, and I want everyone to know that she is amazing. Okay, thank you.
I feel the same way. Thank you, Senator McDowell.
Okay, so on to page 8. Again, we're still in the definition section of Act 250. And this is an amendment to the definition of mixed income housing. Mixed income housing is currently part of the priority housing project definition. So that's why it should sound familiar. This is another change that has been characterized previously as a housekeeping change. So this is a piece of language that was considered also in prior sessions. It was proposed by the NRB, I think 2 years ago, and it's changing the definition because this definition of mixed income housing is based on calculations that Vermont Housing Finance Agency does every year to establish what the affordable housing thresholds are. And it was pointed out that the definition in Act 250 does not actually match the calculation that they do currently at VHFA. And so this is bringing it up to match the definition of what they currently do every year. So I can't speak to how different that calculation actually is. You may want to hear from VHFA, but this is to reflect that VHFA changed their calculations and the language in the statute did not change.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll have VHFA in. I talked to Ms. Collins actually earlier today, and she was reminding me they haven't done this for years. There is no such number that's cited in statute. And so it's an awkwardness that they don't do the math this way anymore. And the statute continues to refer to something that's obsolete. So this wires us into their current way of doing the math.
So it will now read owner occupied housing. At least 20% of the housing units meet the requirement of affordable owner occupied housing as defined in subdivision 29A of this section, adjusted for the number of bedrooms as established and published annually by VHFA. And then it is the same or nearly the same for rental housing. For not less than 15 years following the date that rental housing is initially placed in service, at least 20% of the housing units meet the requirements of affordable rental housing under 29B, adjusted for the number of bedrooms as published by VHFA.
I don't understand what that means. I mean, just housing is housing. Does a definition change after 15 years, or does that mean it can be rezoned, or what does that mean?
Right. So under this provision, and it's used in the priority housing project definition, rental housing needs to only be affordable for not less than 15 years. So the affordability covenant needs to only last for 15 years.
What was the number before the number 15?
Oh, good question. I think when it was initially passed, it was 30 years, and then it was dropped to 20, and then it was 15. I can check and get you the exact years that happened.
So does that mean that after it used to be that if public monies went into something for affordable housing, that the owners of the constructed properties had to obey or abide by certain conditions for 30 years before they evicted everyone and sold it as condos? Or other stuff? Or
They
storage
only had to
rental units
maintain-
or whatever?
They only had to maintain it as affordable rental housing for 15 years. And then, yes, after the 15 years, they could make a change.
Right,
So it used to be that they had to maintain it for affordable housing for 30 years.
Yes.
And now this bill would mean that they can, the owners are no longer obligated to have it affordable housing. They can, is that what we're doing?
So this bill, no, it's been 15 years actually for a couple of years. This bill is not changing the number of years. That was changed in a prior session.
We in the Vermont legislature allowed them to throw people out in half the time that they used to be thrown out before?
Yes.
Wow.
So let's get the history on what those, because I think there were different timetables, if I'm remembering right, which I may not, for rental versus owned housing in terms of that affordability component. But I think the change from 20 to 15 was something like 5 years ago when I was on economic development. So yes, I share your, so when we speak to, so this the only change here is it's not about years or the percentage of units. It's about connecting us to the contemporary way of doing the math at VHFA. But you brought this up the other day, and I appreciate the question. You know, to what degree are we seeing if we're providing? I think you used, incentives in the form of relief from Act 250 proceedings. Is there a compensatory benefit? And what is it? Well, one might argue that it's that 20% of those units are affordable. Is that enough? And for how long a period do they need to remain affordable? So anyway, so what I'm doing here is just updating the cross-reference, but there's issues of merit to be discussed underneath there for sure. Senator Westman.
You're on mute.
We can't hear you yet.
I would think would follow somewhat in the same line as Senator McDonald, and realizing by bringing this up, we could spend all kinds of time on it and never get a bill out. But these limits of 20% for affordable housing were done in a time. Housing has become extremely more expensive. And not only is it people that would fit in the affordable category that are being priced out of houses, but I think that a lot of middle-class families are being priced out of houses, and particularly lower middle that are above the category of individuals that would fit in affordable housing.
Okay. So
at least some testimony about the issue and what these numbers represent. At some point, we should take a look at.
Right. I agree. We were talking about that. There's that group of people from so I think they use area median income, and they adjust for the number of bedrooms, they adjust for the household size, and they adjust for where you are in the state. And so the number varies, but at any rate, we've repeatedly run into people in that 80 to 120% of AMI category are under stress, and sometimes we're better at serving people below 80 sometimes, and people at 120 and up may be able to handle things that others can't. So I think it's a good question. Is there a gap that's not getting help?
I just saw a house in my neighborhood that 20 years ago sold for under 100,000, just sold for nearly 400,000. And I think that stretch is putting people, if you're in an $80,000 range, you're hard pressed to find any place.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir. Senator McDonald.
We are building affordable housing for people who don't earn enough money to be able to buy a house. And Senator Westman just gave us another example. We're socializing with funding and support for helping people who can no longer afford this. And when we do that, it's a form of socialism. And if I'm going to support socialism, my test towards doing it, if I'm going to be called a socialist, is that it narrows the gap between those people who own many homes and those people who can't afford a place to live. And I'll be damned if I'm going to be tagged with being a socialist if, while I'm being a socialist, the working folks are falling farther behind. you might as well why would we be doing things that allows them to fall farther behind? I'm going back to the 15 years versus 30 years. Why is that an acceptable goal for us to achieve? I mean,
It's a great question. I mean, I put this in here knowing that we would have a discussion, and it's a status quo, but my conversation with people as I was thinking about was exactly along the same line. So, well, haven't we given some ground on reducing the number of years of the longevity of the affordability covenant? Have we not reduced the percentage of housing that needs to meet those requirements to be obtain, affordability? So I think, and it's a great question. I appreciate it, and we'll take some testimony.
Sometimes if we're trying to link language up from one place to another, instead of putting in 15, we put in a couple of X's and say the purpose of this was to link things up. But when you put a number in, it takes a life of its own.
Right.
Are we trying to restore what we used to do, or are we conceding that, where is the person who bought the $100,000 house for $400,000, kicking into the social changes that we're putting into statute? So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. You asked a version of this question end of last week, and I've been thinking about it and having conversations ever since. So I'm not, just by way of explanation, I left the status quo in the language here, other than amending this cross-reference, but I take the questions to heart and we'll take testimony on it. Senator McCormick. We can't hear you yet, Senator.
Sorry. In the interest of brevity, I would like to ride piggyback on the remarks of the senator from Orange.
Mr. Clerk, would you journalize their remarks? Thank you. Okay. So let's keep going. I also realize we have Ms. Horn here to talk about 200. So and obviously we're not going to finish. Floor was longer than we thought, and the committee has more good questions about this draft. Then it's hard to know how long it will walk through will take. We'll be taking this back up tomorrow. So I'm looking for a natural break in the walk through. Ms. Chakowski, is this a good place to stop? What do you say?
Yes, or I could do the next section.
Yeah, let's do the next one because it's again on rivers.
Yeah. So on page 9, section 5, this is amending criterion 1D of Act 250. As you all know, Act 250 has 10 criteria. This one is updating to again use the current definition the ANR uses. So it's changing criterion 1D to be about floodways, to changing it to being about flood hazard areas and river corridors. So it reads, a permit will be granted whenever it will be demonstrated by the applicant that in addition to all other applicable criteria, the development or subdivision of lands within a flood hazard area or river corridor will not restrict or divert the flow of floodwaters, cause or contribute to fluvial erosion, and endanger the health, safety, and welfare of the public or riparian owners during flooding. So it's condensing this criterion. Currently, there's two aspects, one about floodways and one about floodway fringe. And so this is condensing it into one sentence that refers to both flood hazard areas and river corridors. So I think it could be considered a housekeeping change, but you would probably want to hear testimony
Yep.
to confirm that.
So if I may,
Senator Campion, please.
thank you, Mr. Chair. So it doesn't, it's not changing any real policy by doing this.
It's not changing the criteria. It's the criterion itself dramatically, but it is changing the metric that's being used to the one that ANR has developed in the last 10 to 15 years, which is flood hazard areas and river corridors, which was a slightly different metric than they were using with floodways and floodway fringe.
The impact of which would be what?
I do think you should hear testimony on this, but because ANR changed those definitions years ago, I do think the NRB has been using the definitions ANR changed. And so this would bring the statute to reflect that.
Okay, thank you.
So we should hear from agency plus NRB. Thank you. Just to button that down, make sure that it's true. Okay. All right, great. So that brings us to section 6, and let's pause there. I'm going to ask everyone to hold on to their hats, and we're going to have a change of bill, although not really a change of topic. So good morning, Ms. Horn. As I mentioned, Ms. Horn's in today. We'll have another witness, Ms. Holler, in tomorrow to help us assess the response of VLCT and your member municipalities to the proposal offered in S200, the master permit Act 250 proposal. So good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Karen Horn with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. And Mr. Chair, we're very encouraged by the version of the bill that you were just going through. I know that's not the bill I'm testifying on, but same issue as you said. I am testifying on S200, and as was the case a couple of weeks ago, we're opposed to this proposal because it would establish another layer of process on the already pretty considerable process that municipalities go through for designated areas. They've done the work, they have the capacity, and we really feel like it's time to move ahead with making it easier to develop and redevelop housing in our downtowns. So we've supported H511 over in the House, and we've supported those provisions in the Senate Economic Development Committee. And we really do think that that's the direction this committee needs to go in, which is, I believe, in your most recent draft of S234. I'm happy to take questions, and I'm going to apologize for my squeaking dog in the background. He just decided to wake up.
Okay. Well, it's a dog's life, as they say.
Yes.
Some of us probably wish that we were just waking up. So Senator McCormick, you're the sponsor of S200. I don't know if, as the person who's given it the most thought, do you have any questions or observations?
No, and I don't. Well, observations maybe. I don't have any questions. I'm well aware of the league's position on this. I think it finally gets down to that the committee is going to have to decide: do we want to continue at 250 jurisdiction and the benefits of that jurisdiction, or do we not? And I'm aware of the league's position on that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Any other committee comments or questions? All right. Well, if it's any consolation, Senator McCormick, I received the same medicine about 2 weeks ago. So familiar with the response. Okay, and sympathetic. All right. Well, thank you, Ms. Horn, for coming in and giving us, straight useful testimony. With that, rather than return to, spending 5 more minutes on the current draft of S-234, let me just pause and see if there are any committee questions, or discussion. So again, I appreciate everyone going through another draft, trying to get something on the table to help come to an agreement that feels meaningful to us, like meaningful progress, both on developing additional housing in smart growth centers, or according to smart growth guidelines, and at the same time bringing in more provisions to enhance our work on forestry.
I think we're getting, if I may, to a Mr. Chair, to a good spot. The road rule is still in this.
That is correct.
Yeah. So I think we're getting, this is becoming, I think moving in a direction where I think we're going to get most, if not all parties signing on to it.
Okay. And Senator Westman and I continue to have prior to, it's usually Monday or early Tuesday, meeting with NRB and ANR just to keep the communications open on the fine details, try to keep things moving. But every single thing, of course, that we talk about in there ends up in a bill or in testimony. So I just want to reassure people that we're just trying to make it so that when we do have our limited committee time, we've assembled as much information as possible, and so that we can get through as much material as possible with people prepared to help us sort it out. So, okay. And again, just for, you think about the week, tomorrow we're back on S-234. We'll be spending the morning on this, so we'll have more time to go through the finish our walkthrough, as well as take some testimony from a number of parties. So Mr. Shupin from the NRC, as well as the Agency of Natural Resources, as well as Jen Holler from VHCB. And we have counsel with us for the morning to help do that work. Chuck Storrow is coming in to talk to us a legal issue that may or may not, well, we just need to learn about it. He has a concern about liens and how the law may have some impact on that. On Thursday, we're back to environmental justice. And then Friday, we're back to Act 250, having given it 48 hours for maybe a next draft to be ready for our committee work. And the other thing I just wanted to say, in case there are people watching who are interested in our Fish and Wildlife Bills hearing, that's Thursday night, 5:30 to 7:30. People may know that in, I think, 24 hours or less, over 300 people attempted to sign up, and we had to turn off registration because we're going to be able to get to somewhere between 60 and 70 people during our hearing. We're also going to have training with legislative IT, because there are some things for us to manage differently than a current meeting. So Jude, can you remind me and the committee what time we will have that training on Thursday late afternoon?
Yes, it's 4:30. And just to remind Senator Campion, you will have a special role to play. You will let people know at 10 seconds, they only have 10 seconds left. And then you will, after they finish their sentence or thought, you will remove them from the room. But they're going to go over all that training at 4:30 Thursday. It's about a 15-minute training, I'm told.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Great.
We're putting Campion in charge of cutting people off.
Hey, we're still live.
I'm just checking.
I think Senator Westman, if you would stop talking, that's my practice right now. You have 5, 4, 3, 2.
All right. So